Hey, Jared from EBMX. Today I'm running you through the construction and how to maintain the upgraded competition jackshaft we made. So I'm just going to run you through what the changes are compared to a traditional Ultra B jackshaft. So I've got two on my hand here. So what happens with the stock jackshaft and what we found is that this being out of aluminium, it obviously makes it lighter, but the issue here is it makes it a lot weaker. So when you have constant impact loads on these bearings, so as you're jumping and you're riding, the rear wheel is physically moving off the ground, you have this like traction input that happens. Basically, this bearing gets slammed and slammed. These bearings eventually also break down and it ovals this physical shape. So that's the first issue we had. The second issue that we also found is that on impact loadings, the actual sprocket that attached to here would actually physically shear off all the M6 bolts. Now we moved to higher 12.9 grade bolts and still managed to physically shear these. And sometimes with the 12.9 grade bolts, we went up to that strength. We even bent basically essentially all the aluminium housing here on impact landings. So what we did to combat that is a few different things here. So one, we made it completely out of steel. Unfortunately, that means we can't anodize it pretty colors, we can't make it pink and purple, etc. So we can only kind of go with basically black or silver. So this is completely zinc plated, so it doesn't rust. If we did powder coat it some fancy colors, unfortunately that powder coat would eventually come off and we would end up having rusting on this part. So it does look more like an industrial product than something that's an anodized aluminium product. The next thing, because we made it steel, much stronger. So once again, we managed to increase this radius, which means we've got larger bearings in here. We also have different bearings as well. So one of the things we've done with the bearings as well as made them physically larger. So the stock Ultra B jackshaft has only roller bearings in it. So basically what that means is you have little tiny ball bearings that are basically sitting a race in here. And because there's only a small amount of that bearing in contact with the surface, when you get impacts, obviously that force is distributed to a smaller area. This breaks down the bearing a lot faster. So what we did in the Ultra B jackshaft that we upgraded, we made these bearings bigger. We use a combination of this bearing, which these are really good for speed, but they're really bad for static loading. So we use a hybrid bearing, which basically incorporates a roller bearing and a needle bearing in the same bearing set. So what that does is we obviously have our radial bearing, which is really good for speed, and we also have our longer bearing inside there, which is really good for static loads because the load is spread across a larger area inside that bearing race. So as well as they're bigger, obviously they're a much better bearing design, and they're designed both for speed and also the spec for this bearing, even the roller bearing and the needle bearing we've used, all exceed the RPM that we can ever see on an Ultra B motor, any of the upgraded ones. So it's 100% designed and fit for purpose. The next thing we did, aside from changing the bearings and the construction of it, is because we had this shearing issue, the only way we could fix that was to basically install a spline. So what we've done, we've basically installed a spline, we've made a new spline sprocket. To make this even stronger, we've gone up one tooth from the original design. So in installing this, you will lose a tiny bit of low down torque. Technically by installing this, because we're one tooth more here, it's like you've gone two teeth down on the rear. So I'd recommend if you are to install this, you want to keep the exact same torque figure you had down low before and not just gain top speed, that I would install this and I would then put two teeth up on your rear sprocket to get you exactly back where you were. If you're happy with your low down torque, even with this, you will get additional speed with this setup because it's one tooth more than what was originally there. The main reason for doing this is basically for the reason that if you make this surface area larger, you also make the sprocket stronger. So the whole thing is basically engineered, fit for purpose for you to ride your Ultra B hard. So whether you're a weekend rider and you just want ultimate reliability, this is the way to go. But if you're hitting the track, 100% no way you can do it on an Ultra B unless you have something like this. And especially if you're running chain drive for reliability, you really need something like this to make sure you don't have that failure. So in regards to maintaining this, super simple. Obviously we've seen a lot of designs with grease nipples and everything in here. My main issue is the thing that breaks bearings down is not so much that the grease dries out, it's the fact that you get dirt in here. So no matter how many grease nipples you put on this and how much grease you pump into this, you are physically not going to be able to remove the dirt without cleaning it. So what I would recommend is every 6 months you re-grease this, and every year I would pull this down and just basically clean this with some kind of mineral turpentine or some kind of white spirit to basically get the physical grit out of the bearings. So I'm just going to show you how you disassemble it and how you would clean it and how you would re-grease it. So super simple. Let's say you pull this out of the bike. Literally just put your finger in here. You want to remove these in this order. This will physically come out. We get a view, this one's already greased. You can see here, this is the needle bearings that I was talking about before that physically sit in here. So this one is a combination. This one actually has the most shock load on it. So this side here essentially has just needle bearings that are rated for the RPM on this side. On the other side, same procedure again. You remove your insert. You're gonna have 2 in here as well. Literally can pull these out with your finger. You can see your bearings physically in here. So the last bearing in here, which you can't actually see down, is actually got the hybrid bearing with the balls on this internal side. Now, as far as greasing, pretty simple. Just literally grease on your finger. I'll do this now. Grease on your finger. Just put this in. Make sure you get the grease all the way in there. Same on the other side. So super simple. Just want to make sure everything's greased up like this, and then it's just a matter of reassembling the bearing. So once again, let's go back in the reverse order. Like so. You'll notice on this, there's actually 2 different lengths here. So the longer one will go in first, followed by your shorter. And then your cap. You'll see as well here that there's actually a physical line here. So that line is to physically go in this way. That'll clip into place. And just get a rag. And clean off like so. And you've re-greased it. And as far as cleaning this thing, the same procedure again goes, is you'll pull out these inserts, and I would physically just basically wash this thing backwards and forwards in white spirit, wear gloves, and essentially just move the bearings around, keep moving it in and out, and that'll basically dislodge anything in there. So I just don't see any way that you would ever physically clean this with a grease port on here and physically clean the actual grit out of this, as it does get dirty. But in our testing, I've had this in my bike for about 6 months now. I've pulled mine apart, stripped it down. I've had no grit or anything in there, and the grease looks really good. If you ride every weekend, definitely I'll just re-grease it 6 months. If you're riding, 6 months of the year, you're probably going to be fine to only service this once a year. And realistically, you could probably leave it for forever. It will fail at some point, but if you do want to maintain things, you want things to last, that 6 months to 12-month interval would be a great idea.